Robby, what's on your radar today?
Well, here's a hair-raising headline. Quote, the National Health Institute did not properly track a group studying coronaviruses, a report finds. The group in question is EcoHealth Alliance, and that's the controversial NGO at the center of the whole COVID lab leak gain-of-function debate. And the report in question was authored by the Office of the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Oh, and did I mention that headline appeared in the New York Times? So even the Gray Lady and the Biden administration are raising concerns about reckless research and misappropriated federal funds at the organization studying bad coronaviruses at Wuhan, under Dr. Fauci's watch nonetheless. We should probably be afraid, very afraid. And in fact, both EcoHealth Alliance and the NIH made serious mistakes, according to the report and the New York Times write-up of it. On the NIH side, federal regulators failed to follow proper procedures and request necessary progress reports on EcoHealth's experiments on viruses. A scientist consulted by the New York Times called the report a, quote, damning indictment of the NIH. That was Lawrence Gostin, a public health law expert at Georgetown University, who advises the White House. He said the report shows, quote, grave errors in following NIH's own rules and also in just a diligent monitoring and oversight that the public would have expected. According to the report, the NIH specifically chose not to apply high-risk scrutiny to the grants the federal government was making to EcoHealth Alliance for research on bat coronaviruses. The NIH was supposed to do this additional review on research involving pathogens that could cause a pandemic, but they failed to do so with EcoHealth Alliance. One expert consulted by the Times said that instead of erring on the side of caution, the NIH erred on the side of complacency, on the side of turning a blind eye to how taxpayer dollars were being used in Wuhan. On the EcoHealth side, the report slammed the NGO for failing to guarantee that recipients of federal grants met federal requirements. One such grant recipient, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So this stinks to high heaven. As Republican Senator Rand Paul pointed out, the very agency in charge of making sure that research on viral pathogens in foreign countries is done safely was asleep at the wheel, failing to conduct, quote, adequate oversight. Recall that in his 7-hour deposition in November, Anthony Fauci said that he couldn't remember whether during the period of the federal ban on gain-of-function research, he had ever signed off on waiver requests to allow the experimentation to take place anyway. Now, to be clear, he said that he thinks such waivers were in fact granted, but he doesn't know whether he personally approved them. At the end of the day, we might never know COVID's origins for certain. But it's impossible to shake that nagging feeling that something went wrong. Maybe it was inside a lab that wasn't following proper safety protocols, that wasn't subjected to rigorous scrutiny, the scrutiny required by law, despite receiving funding from U.S. taxpayers, overseen by an out-of-touch agency and a scientific establishment that was not nearly deferential enough to the real possibility of creating something monstrous.
Yeah, I think it seems pretty clear that even though it is as yet unproved as to whether or not the origin of COVID was from a lab leak, the fact that it is possible that such a thing could come from a lab leak makes it extremely concerning that the protocols, in effect, to guard against that possibility, that outcome, aren't in effect and haven't been in effect. And apparently, they're still struggling to put them into effect even after we're living 3 years into a pandemic. It's deeply disturbing, and I'm not surprised that that this is a story that you're reading in the mainstream New York Times context.
Yeah, and I emphasize the mainstream context because this isn't, some COVID contrarian saying, oh, it was a mess in Wuhan and they're not there. This is the mainstream. This is a report by the Department of Health and Human Services looking at the National Institute of Health, the organization headed by Dr. Fauci, and looking at their review of grants to EcoHealth Alliance, which was given all this money, taxpayer money, to do research on bat coronaviruses in Wuhan. And we know from ProPublica and other reporting that there was alarming lack of standards in place at Wuhan, and by standards I mean cleanliness, how the animals were being handled. There was communications with the Chinese government where there was warning signs, like something had gone really wrong, that the facility itself was built in a substandard way. All of those concerns. Now, EcoHealth doing, and we've seen a study, reports that they had commissioned talking about, their scientists talking about the kind of research they're doing, which is exactly the kind of frightening research, the kind of research that runs the risk of creating something like exactly what happened. And now we're finding out that so according to the report, there was supposed to be an additional review team for high risk research being done. And they just didn't subject it to that review.
That's what's so disturbing. Like there were policies and protocols in place, and they weren't followed, which gives one pause. Because I mean, what do you do at that point? Put more protocols and policies in place for people to ignore? Is there going to be any accountability? That's something that I see missing from this article. You know, what are the consequences for the people who did not man their post, who did not provide the oversight that the rules said that they were supposed to have provided? And is ultimately, this is a question that you've been asking for a while now, Anthony Fauci responsible, and to what extent, now that he's kind of off in retirement land, is there going to be any avenue for accountability for him? Especially
when the wrongdoing is a sort of just rubber stamping and letting it go, like papers. That's what he said in his deposition. Well, papers cross my desk all the time. I don't remember exactly everything I signed off on. And I'm like, okay, but this was very dangerous research. The National Institute of Health knows it was very dangerous research because they had protocols in place to subject it to additional review. That did not happen.
Right. Look, and I'm not trying to be overly carceral here. This is not what I'm arguing. But it does strike me as interesting that if, you know, one of these scientists were to have stolen a phone, they'd be held accountable. If they fail to provide, you know, the oversight conditions that they're supposed to be providing as part of their job in a way that potentially led to a pandemic that killed millions of people across the globe, shut down global economies, cost untold billions and trillions of dollars, there's just no accountability mechanism whatsoever, even outside of a kind of a criminal justice context. And frankly, honestly, I've said this before, the fact of the consequences, the economic consequences, the liabilities of COVID being so high, I think makes me very skeptical that even if it were a lab leak, even if this was kind of a human error issue, that we'll ever get to the bottom of it, because whoever's responsible would be destroyed. Whatever institutions, whatever people, it would be the end of them. And so the incentive to protect whatever the origin story is, assuming it's not natural, is just enormous.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost to that. This is a quote from Stalin, right? One death is a tragedy, 1 million a statistic. It's so, the harm of this is so difficult to grapple with because it's so vast. Like if one person died in a lab accident because of substandard safety protocols that the NIH didn't, that you would expect someone would be held accountable, because the harm is almost more obvious if it's just contained to one person. This is the entire planet, millions and millions of people destroyed.
They're judgment proof, yeah.
It's hard to even reckon with it. But I think we are obligated to try. I think we are obligated to try to get to the bottom of this. This is, you know, one of the most consequential, horrible things that has happened in our lifetime.
Yes.
And there is a very real chance it had to do with policy choices. And I mean, honestly, it had to do with policy choices either way, because if this is about animals being kept in unsafe conditions and being sold, I mean, fine, then that is something that should be discussed through the lens of corrective policy as well. So honestly, there is
that's a very interesting point, Rob, because there's this interesting tension between the libs are coming for your hamburger and the mass animal farming practices that exist all over the place are hotbeds for viral growth and bacterial spread and transferring, you know, the kind of evolution of these bacteria and viruses that allow for jumps to human species. Yeah. And at some point, I mean, there are environmental consequences to these things. There are public health consequences to these things. There are ethical consequences to these mass farming events, obviously, capo farms and the like. And we're going to have to reckon with them one way or the other. And it's going to clash against certain kind of ideologies that right now are very strongly held by conservatives.
Yeah, that might be fair enough. I think there is a legitimate. I'm pretty libertarian, as you know. I think there's a legitimate interest in the government preventing the creation of super viruses that could kill us all. I'm okay with that. But I'm especially insistent that the government not go out of its way to incidentally create the super viruses itself, which might be what happened here. We would like to learn more.
100%. Although I will say the government also does subsidize big ag, and there are.
I don't want to subsidize.
You can make the argument that the government is paying for a lot of the things that ultimately are causing these.
And all those subsidies, I would do it. We'll do it. We can go line by line. We'll sit down with a list. We can just end them all.
I love when occasionally your libertarianism and my wanting to sanction big corporations align in these beautiful ways, Robby.
Love shutting down a good subsidy. That's a fun time for all. We'll have more Rising right after this.